Velma Barfield. Between 1971 and 1978, at least 5 people in rural North Carolina died slow, agonizing deaths from arsenic poisoning. The killer was not some shadowy figure lurking in the woods. She was a church-going grandmother in her 40s who cooked dinner for her victims, held their hands while they got sick, and then cashed their checks before the funerals were over. Velma Barfield was born Margie Velma Bullard on October 29, 1932, in a small town in the Carolina lowlands. She grew up in a violent household with an alcoholic father. Her first husband, Thomas Burke, died in a house fire in 1969. She later admitted she had set it. By the time she was middle-aged, she had buried 2 husbands and developed a crushing addiction to prescription tranquilizers, antidepressants, and amphetamines that consumed everything and everyone around her. The addiction was the engine behind everything. Barfield cycled through caretaking jobs and relationships, and in each one the pattern repeated. She would forge checks, steal money to buy pills, and when the person she was stealing from started asking questions, she would lace their food or drink with an over-the-counter ant and roach poison containing arsenic. Her mother, Lily Bullard, died in December of 1974. An elderly client named Dolly Edwards died in March of 1977. John Henry Lee, the husband of another client, died 3 months later. Her second husband, Jennings Barfield, had died back in 1971. Every one of them suffered the same symptoms: nausea, vomiting, organ failure. Every one of them was buried without suspicion. Then came Stuart Taylor. He was her fiancé, a tobacco farmer she had been dating for 2 years. On February 3, 1978, Taylor collapsed and died after days of violent illness. His daughter refused to accept the explanation. She pushed for an autopsy. Toxicology came back positive for arsenic, and Barfield was arrested on May 13, 1978. During interrogation, she confessed to Taylor's killing. Then she kept talking. She admitted to poisoning her mother, Edwards, and Lee. She would later admit to her second husband as well. Prosecutors in Bladen County brought in Joe Freeman Britt, a district attorney so prolific that the Guinness Book of Records had named him the deadliest prosecutor in America for securing 23 death sentences in 28 months. The trial lasted just 2 weeks. The jury convicted her on December 2, 1978, and sentenced her to die. Her insanity defense failed. Barfield spent 6 years on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh. During that time, she became a born-again Christian. She counseled other inmates, studied scripture, and corresponded with ministers across the country. Evangelist Billy Graham spoke with her by phone in her final days and reportedly told her that, in a way, he envied her because she would get to heaven before he did. His daughter, Anne Graham Lotz, attended the execution as a witness. Governor James B. Hunt denied clemency on September 27, 1984. He was locked in a tight Senate race against Jesse Helms, and the political pressure was immense, but his statement made no mention of politics. He said he could not justify making an exception to the law enacted by the state legislature, or overruling the 12 jurors who concluded that Barfield should pay the maximum penalty for her brutal actions. He added that the victims had been literally tortured to death. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh. She was 52 years old. She chose pink pajamas, requested cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola instead of a final meal, and asked to donate her organs. In her last statement, she said she knew everybody had gone through a lot of pain, that all the families connected to the case had suffered, and that she was sorry. She was the first woman executed in the United States in 22 years. The last had been Elizabeth Ann Duncan, who was put to death in California's San Quentin gas chamber back in 1962. Barfield was also the first woman ever killed by lethal injection, anywhere in the country. And somehow, it gets worse. Because Barfield was not the last woman to face that needle. Over the next 4 decades, more would follow, and the case that came 14 years later would become one of the most debated executions in American history. Karla Faye Tucker. On a summer night in 1983, in a low-rent apartment complex in Houston, Texas, a 23-year-old woman helped kill 2 people with a pickaxe. 14 years later, that same woman had millions of people around the world begging for her life, including the Pope. Karla Faye Tucker was born on November 18, 1959, and by the time she was a teenager, she was already deep in a world most people never see. She started using drugs before she turned 10 and was regularly accompanying her mother to bars and parties before she was old enough to drive. By her early 20s, she was living with a man named Daniel Ryan Garrett and using heroin, methamphetamine, Valium, and alcohol in combinations that would have killed most people outright. In the early morning hours of June 13, 1983, Tucker and Garrett broke into the Houston apartment of Jerry Lynn Dean, a 27-year-old acquaintance they intended to rob for motorcycle parts. What happened inside that apartment was not a robbery. Dean was beaten with a hammer and then struck repeatedly with a 3-pound pickaxe. Deborah Ruth Thornton, a 32-year-old woman who happened to be staying the night, was also killed. The pickaxe was found still embedded in her chest. During the trial, Tucker admitted under oath that she had experienced a kind of euphoria with each swing. She later attributed this to the fog of a 3-day drug binge that included heroin, speed, Percodan, marijuana, rum, and tequila. She recanted the statement entirely in the years that followed. Both Tucker and Garrett were arrested on July 20, 1983. Her trial began in April of 1984 before a jury of 8 women and 4 men. She was convicted and sentenced to death on April 25th. Garrett also received a death sentence but died of liver disease on death row in 1993 before the state could carry it out. What happened next on death row is the part that divided the entire country. Tucker became a born-again Christian almost immediately after her incarceration. By all accounts, from guards, chaplains, and fellow inmates, the conversion was genuine and total. She married a prison minister named Dana Lane Brown by proxy in 1995. She volunteered in prison programs, mentored other inmates, and became a model prisoner for more than a decade. The question that tore the country apart was simple. Can a person change so completely that the punishment no longer fits the crime? Her clemency campaign was unlike anything the American death penalty system had ever seen. Pope John Paul II personally appealed to Governor George W. Bush. Televangelists Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, both strong supporters of capital punishment, publicly asked for mercy. The European Parliament passed a resolution calling for her sentence to be commuted. Thousands of letters poured into the governor's office. Bush refused. He said that he had concluded judgments about the heart and soul of an individual on death row are best left to a higher authority, and asked that God bless Karla Faye Tucker and her victims and their families. On February 3, 1998, Tucker was executed by lethal injection at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas. She was declared dead at 6:45 in the evening. She was 38 years old, and she was the first woman executed in Texas since Chipita Rodriguez was hanged in 1863 for killing a horse trader. In her final statement, she told the Thornton family and Jerry Dean's family that she was so sorry and that she hoped God would give them peace. She said she loved everyone who had been good to her, and that she was going to be face to face with Jesus. Richard Thornton, Deborah's husband, watched from the witness room. When the drugs took hold, he said aloud that she was coming and told his wife she was all hers now. He added that the world was a better place. The execution captain who oversaw her death, a man named Fred Allen, resigned from his position shortly after. Years later, he told filmmaker Werner Herzog that he had been pro-capital punishment his entire career, but after Tucker and all the executions he had managed, he no longer believed anyone had the right to take another life. Tucker's case did not settle the debate over redemption and punishment. If anything, it cracked it wide open. But the woman who followed her to the execution chamber just 8 weeks later had no redemption story to offer, and no one begging for mercy. Judias Buenoano. The name Buenoano is a rough Spanish translation of the English word good year. She chose it herself years earlier as a tribute to her first husband, the same husband she had poisoned to death with arsenic. That coincidence is what eventually helped investigators connect the dots. Judias Welty Buenoano was born on April 4, 1943, and by the time law enforcement finally caught up with her, she had left a trail of dead men and collected an estimated $240,000 in life insurance payouts. Her first confirmed victim was Air Force Sergeant James Goodyear, her husband, who died on September 16, 1971, in Orlando, just 3 months after returning home from Vietnam. He had survived combat overseas only to die in his own home. He spent weeks in the hospital with mysterious symptoms before his organs gave out. The cause of death was not determined at the time. Nobody ordered a toxicology screen. Nobody asked why a healthy soldier was suddenly dying. Years later, his body was exhumed, and analysis revealed lethal levels of arsenic. Her boyfriend, Bobby Joe Morris, died in Colorado in 1978 with eerily similar symptoms. She collected $50,000 in life insurance. Then came her own son. Michael Goodyear Buenoano was 19 years old and had been partially paralyzed for years. Investigators would later determine that the paralysis itself was caused by long-term arsenic exposure, meaning she had been slowly poisoning her own child. On May 13, 1980, Buenoano took Michael out on a canoe trip on the East River near Milton, Florida. The canoe capsized. Michael, weighed down by 15-pound leg and arm braces that he relied on because of the paralysis she had caused, drowned. She collected his life insurance. And no, I am not making that up. Her next target survived. John Gentry was her fiancé. She had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on him and had been feeding him arsenic-laced capsules she told him were vitamin C. When that did not kill him fast enough, she planted a car bomb. On June 25, 1983, the bomb detonated when Gentry started his car. He survived with severe injuries. Pensacola police searched her home and found bomb-making materials. Investigators started pulling the thread. They noticed the surname connection between Goodyear and Buenoano, a detail that might seem obvious in hindsight, but had gone unnoticed for over a decade. They exhumed Sergeant Goodyear's body in 1984, and the arsenic results broke the case open. She was convicted of the attempted murder of Gentry in Pensacola, then convicted of first-degree murder in Orange County for killing her husband, and separately convicted for the drowning death of her son. Across 3 jurisdictions, the picture was the same. A woman who had systematically killed the people closest to her for insurance money, then moved on to the next target. The prosecutor, Russell Edgar, called her a black widow who feeds off her mates and her young, and said the motive was twisted greed. The total insurance money she collected across all her victims was estimated at $240,000. On March 30, 1998, Just 8 weeks after Carla Faye Tucker's execution in Texas, Judius Buenoano was put to death in Florida's electric chair at 7:08 in the morning. She was 54 years old. When the warden asked if she had any final words, she quietly answered no. A prison spokesperson announced that the prisoner had been pronounced dead at 7:13 a.m. She was the first woman electrocuted in the United States since Rhonda Bell Martin in Alabama in 1957, and the first woman executed in Florida since 1848. Her cousin Jean Eaton said afterward that Buenoano had shown no fear at all, that she was mostly afraid of leaving her children and how upset they were. Before her execution, in a television interview, Buenoano maintained her innocence. She said she wanted to clear the record for her grandson, and that she wanted him to know his grandmother was not a murderer. The evidence said otherwise. Buenoano killed for money, and she did it patiently, methodically, over more than a decade. But the woman who came next killed for a very different reason, and her case would challenge the legal system in ways nobody expected. Aileen Wuornos. Between late 1989 and November of 1990, 7 middle-aged men were found shot to death along Florida's interstate corridors. Their wallets were missing. Their cars were abandoned miles away. For months, investigators had no suspect, no motive, and no connection between the victims, other than the fact that each one had been killed with a small-caliber firearm and left in remote wooded areas off the highway. The killer turned out to be a 33-year-old woman who had been working as a roadside prostitute along the I-75 and I-95 corridors for years. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, into a childhood defined by abandonment and abuse. Her father was a convicted criminal who took his own life in prison. Her mother left when Aileen was a toddler. She was raised by grandparents in Michigan, and by her mid-teens, she was living on the streets, hitchhiking across the country, and surviving however she could. By the late 1980s, she had drifted to Florida and was living with a woman named Tyria Moore near Daytona Beach. The first victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics shop owner from Clearwater. He was last seen on November 30, 1989, and his body was found on December 13 in a wooded area, shot in the chest. Over the next 12 months, 6 more men turned up dead along Florida's highways, each one shot, robbed, and left in remote locations. David Spears, 43, a construction worker; Charles Carskadden, 40, a rodeo worker; Peter Seams, 65, a retired merchant seaman whose body was never found; Troy Burris, 50, a sausage delivery driver; Charles Humphreys, 56, a retired Air Force major and former police chief who had spent years working child abuse cases; and Walter Jano Antonio, 62, a trucker and reserve police officer. The break came from a pawn shop. Wuornos had pawned items belonging to Mallory, and her thumbprint was on the receipt. Investigators traced the print, identified her, and arrested her on January 9, 1991, at a biker bar called The Last Resort in Port Orange, Florida. It had taken over a year and 7 dead men before anyone connected the cases to a single suspect. Her partner, Tyria Moore, cooperated with police and recorded a phone call in which Wuornos confessed. In exchange, Moore received full immunity. The trial for Mallory's murder opened on January 14, 1992. Wuornos initially claimed self-defense, arguing that Mallory had attacked her. There was one detail that supported this. Mallory did have a prior conviction in Maryland for a violent crime, a fact that was not introduced at trial and was only uncovered later by a television reporter. But Wuornos eventually recanted the self-defense claim for all 7 victims, telling the court she had killed them in cold blood and that she would kill again if given the chance. She was convicted on January 27th and sentenced to death on January 31st, 1992. She later received 5 additional death sentences through plea agreements. You would think someone would have said something along the way about the pattern, about the bodies turning up along the same stretch of highway. Nobody did. Not until a thumbprint from a pawn shop finally connected the dots. Wuornos waived her appeals. Governor Jeb Bush briefly stayed the execution in September of 2002 for a psychiatric evaluation, but 3 state-appointed psychiatrists found her competent to be executed. On October 9, 2002, she was put to death by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. She declined a final meal, accepting only a cup of black coffee. Her last words were strange and disjointed. She said she was sailing with the rock, that she would be back, and compared herself to the movie Independence Day, complete with a mothership. At a plea hearing years earlier, after a judge handed down 3 more death sentences, she had screamed at the assistant state attorney that she hoped terrible things would happen to his family. The outburst was never forgotten. Charlize Theron would later portray Wuornos in the 2003 film Monster, winning the Academy Award for Best Actress. The real Wuornos never saw the film. She had been dead for nearly a year before it reached theaters. If Wuornos represented the most extreme version of a woman pushed to violence by a life on the margins, the case that came next was something quieter, closer to home, and in many ways, far more tragic. Wanda Jean Allen. On December 1, 1988, a 29-year-old woman named Gloria Jean Leathers walked into the parking lot of the village police department in Oklahoma with her mother. They were there to file a domestic violence complaint. She never made it inside. Her partner, Wanda Jean Allen, was waiting in the lot with a gun. Allen shot Leathers once in the abdomen, point blank. Leathers died 4 days later, on December 5th. This was not the first time Allen had killed someone. In 1981, she had shot and killed a friend named Dedra Pettis during an altercation. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter and served 4 years in prison. It was while serving that sentence that she met Gloria Leathers, and the two began a relationship that continued after their release. The relationship was volatile from the beginning. There were police calls, arguments, and a long history of domestic conflict that both families were aware of. Leathers had finally decided to do something about it. That decision cost her everything. Wanda Jean Allen had an IQ that was measured at 69. She had suffered documented brain damage at age 12 when she was struck by a truck while crossing a street. At 14, she sustained a stabbing wound to the temple that caused further neurological injury. Both incidents were in her medical records. Both were available to anyone who looked. Her trial attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Robert Carpenter, had never handled a capital case before and had actually tried to withdraw from the assignment. The court denied his request and ordered him to proceed. During the penalty phase, where a defendant's life history, mental health, and mitigating circumstances are supposed to be presented to the jury, Carpenter did not introduce evidence of Allen's intellectual disability or brain damage. He did not call a neurologist. He did not present the medical records. The jury never heard about any of it. She was convicted of first-degree murder in 1989 and sentenced to death. The appeals that followed tried desperately to raise the issues her trial lawyer had failed to present. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals rejected the ineffective assistance of counsel claims in 1994. Civil rights groups, disability advocates, and Reverend Jesse Jackson all rallied behind her case. Jackson traveled to Oklahoma and was arrested outside the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center the night before her execution in a last-ditch protest. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 3-1 to deny clemency. Governor Frank Keating denied a 30-day stay. He said this was not easy because he was dealing with a fellow human being and a fellow Oklahoman, but that clearly the woman knew right from wrong. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. She was 41 years old. Strapped to the gurney, she spoke her final words. She said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." She was the first woman executed in Oklahoma since statehood in 1907, and the first black woman executed in the United States since 1954. The execution drew national attention, not just because of her gender or race, but because of the mounting evidence that her trial had been fundamentally broken from the start. The cruelest detail of Allen's case came 18 months after her death. In June of 2002, the United States Supreme Court decided Atkins versus Virginia, ruling that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The decision meant that people with Allen's cognitive profile could no longer be sentenced to death anywhere in the country. Had she been sentenced just a few years later, or had her trial attorney done the basic work of introducing the medical records that were sitting in her file, the outcome could have been entirely different. The legal protection she needed existed. It just arrived too late. Gloria Leathers's daughter, LaToya, told reporters after the execution that they were the victims, not Wanda Jean, and that justice had been served. Filmmaker Liz Garbus documented Allen's final months in the 2002 film The Execution of Wanda Jean. Allen's case was a failure that compounded at every level. A childhood marked by injury, a defense attorney who never should have been assigned the case, and a legal standard that arrived just barely too late. But her story was not the darkest one on this list, not even close. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Christina Riggs. On the night of November 4th, 1997, a licensed practical nurse in Sherwood, Arkansas, took the lives of her 2 young children in their home. She then tried to take her own life and failed. When her case went to trial 6 months later, Christina Riggs did something almost no defendant in a capital case has ever done. She asked the jury to give her the death penalty. Riggs was 26 years old and working at the Arkansas Heart Hospital. She was a single mother raising her 5-year-old son and her 2-year-old daughter in a small duplex. By all outward appearances, she was holding things together. But behind closed doors, she was spiraling. The details of what happened that night are a matter of court record, and they are devastating in their finality. Both children were harmed fatally by their mother. She then attempted suicide using medication and other means. Her mother found her unconscious the following morning. The children were already gone. Riggs was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. At trial in Pulaski County, the prosecution laid out the evidence. Riggs had used her medical training in the act. She had planned it. The jury deliberated for 55 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on June 30th, 1998. What happened at sentencing is the part that still haunts people who followed this case. Riggs addressed Judge Marion Humphrey directly. She told him she was going home to be with her babies. When it came time for the jury to weigh her sentence, she told them she wanted to die, that she wanted to be with her babies, and that she was asking them to give her the death penalty. She blocked her own attorneys from presenting mitigating evidence. She waived every appeal. The Arkansas Supreme Court affirmed the conviction in 1999, with Justice Robert L. Brown writing for a 6-1 majority. On May 2, 2000, Christina Riggs was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins Unit near Pine Bluff, Arkansas. The execution was delayed 18 minutes because medical staff had difficulty inserting the catheters. She agreed to let them use veins in her wrists instead. She was 28 years old. In her final statement, she said there was no way words could express how sorry she was for taking the lives of her babies. She said she could now be with her babies, as she had always intended, and that she loved them. She was the first woman executed in Arkansas since the state took over executions in 1913, and the fifth woman executed nationwide since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Governor Mike Huckabee, before setting the execution date, admitted publicly that he found himself very much aware that this would be a first in Arkansas, and that he was not particularly comfortable or necessarily happy with that. The lead prosecutor, Larry Jegley, offered no such ambivalence. He told reporters that one of the things that was clear to the jury was that Riggs was extremely self-centered and manipulative, and that her request to die may have been just another one of the manipulative machinations she had grown comfortable with throughout her life. That's not a typo, by the way. The prosecution's position was that even her desire to die was a form of manipulation. Riggs's case sits in a category that the legal system was never built to handle cleanly. A mother who killed, who confessed, who asked to be punished with death, and who got exactly what she asked for. Whether that was justice or something else entirely depends on where you stand, and there is no comfortable place to stand. But if Riggs's case was difficult to process, the one that followed it was difficult for an entirely different reason. Because Betty Lou Beets had spent years insisting she was the real victim. Betty Lou Beets. When police served a search warrant on a lakeside property in Gun Barrel City, Texas, in June of 1985, they started digging in the front yard. Under an ornamental wishing well, they found the body of the homeowner's fifth husband, wrapped in a sleeping bag. Under the storage shed in the back, they found her fourth. Betty Lou Beets was born Betty Lou Dunavant on March 12, 1937. She had been married 5 times, and by the time detectives started turning over her yard, a pattern had emerged that was hard to ignore. She had shot her second husband, Billy York Lane, in the back. He survived. She had tried to run over her third husband, Ronnie Threlkeld, with a car. He survived. Her fourth husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, was not so lucky. He was found shot to death and buried on the property. And her fifth, retired Dallas firefighter Jimmy Don Beets, was found in the same condition. Jimmy Don Beets had been shot twice in the head with a .38 caliber revolver as he slept on August 6, 1983. Beets buried him under the wishing well, then staged a story about a fishing boat disappearance. She told neighbors and family that Jimmy Don had gone out on the lake and never come back. She filed for his life insurance, which was worth $100,000, and applied for his Dallas firefighter's pension. For nearly 2 years, nobody questioned the story. The investigation that finally unraveled everything began when family members grew suspicious. Her own children, Robert Branson and Shirley Stegner, eventually cooperated with prosecutors and testified against their mother after accepting plea deals. At trial, Beets tried to blame her son Robert for Jimmy Don's killing. The jury did not believe her. She was indicted for capital murder for remuneration, tried in the 173rd District Court of Henderson County, convicted on October 11, 1985, and sentenced to death 3 days later. In the years that followed, Beets's appellate attorneys raised a defense that had not been available during the original trial. They argued that she had suffered decades of severe domestic violence at the hands of multiple husbands, and that battered woman syndrome, which was not a recognized legal defense in Texas in 1985, should have been considered as a mitigating factor. The argument drew significant public attention, but the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 15-0 to deny clemency. Every single member. Governor George W. Bush, facing his second high-profile female execution in 2 years after Carla Faye Tucker, refused a 30-day stay. He said that after careful review of the evidence, he concurred with the jury that Betty Lou Beets was guilty of this murder and that he would not grant a delay. On February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was 62 years old. At the time, she was the oldest person executed in the state since the death penalty had been reinstated. She declined a final meal and made no final statement. Jimmy Don's son, Jamie Beets, witnessed the execution. Afterward, he said he asked that God be with her family. In a pre-execution statement released through her advocates, Beets had written that her time was running out and that the state of Texas would pick up where her husband left off. She said that while Texas law enforcement had done nothing to help her, it was now legal for them to finish the job. To put it in simpler terms, Betty Lou Beets went to her grave claiming she was the victim of the men she had married and the state that had sentenced her. The jury, the parole board, and 2 governors saw it differently. Beets's case forced a hard question about where domestic violence ends and premeditated murder for profit begins. But the case that came next asked an even harder one, about what happens when a killer's own suffering is so extreme that even the legal system cannot agree on what justice looks like. Lisa Montgomery. On January 13, 2021, the United States federal government executed a woman for the first time in 68 years. The last federal execution of a woman had been Bonnie Heady, back in 1953. The woman who broke that gap was Lisa Montgomery, and the crime that put her on death row was unlike anything else in the history of American capital punishment. Lisa Marie Montgomery was born on February 27, 1968. Her childhood was defined by abuse so severe that even the federal court described it in clinical terms that were difficult to read. She was subjected to prolonged mistreatment and harm throughout her early life, including being harmed by members of her own family and by others who were brought into the home. The scope of what was done to her as a child was described in court filings as staggering. On December 16, 2004, Montgomery drove from Melbourne, Kansas, to Skidmore, Missouri, under the alias Darlene Fisher. She had been communicating online with a 23-year-old woman named Bobby Jo Stinnett through a dog breeding forum. Stinnett was 8 months pregnant. Montgomery had been falsely telling friends and family that she herself was expecting a baby, despite having been surgically sterilized years earlier. What happened inside that home in Skidmore was premeditated and horrific. Montgomery strangled Stinnett with a rope and then performed a crude emergency procedure to remove the unborn baby from Stinnett's body. The infant survived. Montgomery took the baby back to Kansas and presented her as her own newborn. Stinnett's mother discovered her daughter's body that afternoon. The investigation moved fast. Police traced Stinnett's last online chat to Montgomery's internet address. Sergeant Randy Strong of the Nodaway County Sheriff's Office arrived at Montgomery's home in Melbourne the very next day, December 17th. Montgomery initially claimed she had given birth at a clinic in Topeka, but she confessed within the hour. The baby, who would be named Victoria Jo Stinnett, was returned to her father Zeb Stinnett after DNA testing confirmed she was not Montgomery's child. Montgomery was charged under the Federal Kidnapping Act, with kidnapping resulting in death. She was tried in the United States District Court for the Western District of Missouri in Kansas City. Her defense team presented extensive evidence of severe mental illness rooted in the abuse she had suffered throughout her childhood. They argued pseudocyesis, a condition in which a person genuinely believes they are pregnant. The prosecution's psychiatrist countered that Montgomery did not actually believe she was pregnant, citing a September 2004 insurance application on which she had denied being pregnant. She was convicted on October 22, 2007, and sentenced to death by Judge Gary Fenner. The final days of Montgomery's case became a legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. A federal judge in Indiana granted a stay on January 11, 2021, ruling that Montgomery's mental state was so divorced from reality that she could not rationally understand why the government wanted to execute her. The Supreme Court vacated the stay in unsigned orders late on January 12th, with Justices Sotomayor, Breyer, and Kagan noting their dissent. Lisa Montgomery was executed by lethal injection at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, and was declared dead at 1:31 in the morning on January 13, 2021. She was the 11th person executed by the federal government since it had resumed executions in July of 2020, after a 17-year pause. When asked for her last words, she said only one word: no. Her attorney, Kelly Henry, released a statement calling the execution the result of what she described as the craven bloodlust of a failed administration. She said everyone who participated should feel shame. Montgomery's case was and remains one of the most contested executions in modern American history. The question it raised was not whether she committed the crime. She did. The question was whether a woman whose childhood had been that devastating could ever be considered fully responsible for what she became. The court said yes. Her defenders said no. And neither side has stopped arguing since. But not every woman sentenced to death in this country has been executed. 2 of them are still alive, still incarcerated, still carrying active death sentences. And in both cases, the state that condemned them has decided for now that it will not carry those sentences out. Cynthia Kaufman. In the fall of 1986, young women began disappearing along the freeways of Southern California. 2 of them were found strangled. The couple responsible for their deaths was caught within weeks, but nearly 4 decades later, the woman convicted in those killings is still alive, still under a death sentence, and still waiting on a row that may never lead to an execution chamber. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman was born on January 19, 1962, in St. Louis, Missouri. In July of 1986, she married a man named James Gregory Marlowe, who went by the name Folsom Wolf. Kaufman bore a tattoo across her body that read, "Property of the Folsom Wolf." Their relationship was defined by domination, control, and escalating violence, and within months of the marriage, that violence turned outward. In October and November of 1986, Kaufman and Marlowe abducted, assaulted, and killed at least 2 young women in Southern California. 20-year-old Corinna Novus was taken near the Redlands Mall on November 7th, strangled with a ligature, and buried in a vineyard in Fontana. Her body was recovered on November 15th after Kaufman led police to the site. 19-year-old Lynnell Murray was abducted at gunpoint from a dry cleaning shop in Huntington Beach on November 12th, then strangled in a motel. The pair was also suspected in the October murders of Sandra Neary and Pamela Simmons, though they were never formally charged in those cases. Kaufman and Marlowe were arrested on November 14, 1986, in Big Bear City, after they used one of the victims' credit cards. The arrest led investigators to search their vehicle and their motel rooms, where they found physical evidence linking the pair to multiple crimes. A jailhouse informant later testified that Kaufman had said killing Novus made her feel really good. Marlowe, for his part, had told an acquaintance that there would not be any witnesses, asking how the victim was going to talk to anybody if she was under a pile of rocks. Their joint trial for the Novus murder opened on July 18, 1989, before Judge Don Turner in San Bernardino County. Both were convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including robbery murder, burglary murder, kidnapping, and forcible sodomy. Both were sentenced to death on August 30, 1989. Kaufman became the first woman sentenced to death in California since the state reinstated the penalty in 1977. In a separate 1992 trial in Orange County for Lynell Murray's murder, Kaufman presented a battered woman defense, supported by testimony from psychologist Lenore Walker. The jury in that case did not unanimously vote for death, and she received life without parole instead. Marlowe received a separate death sentence for Murray's killing. The California Supreme Court affirmed both death sentences on August 19, 2004. Justice Catherine Werdegar, writing for the court, noted that the jury had not been persuaded that Kaufman suffered from such physical abuse or emotional oppression as to warrant a sentence less than death. Kaufman is now 64 years old and remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. She will likely never be executed. Governor Gavin Newsom signed Executive Order No. 919 on March 13, 2019, suspending all executions in the state. The death chamber at San Quentin has been dismantled. The lethal injection protocol has been repealed. Under regulations approved in January of 2024, Kaufman and other condemned inmates have been moved out of segregated death row housing and into general population. Marlowe is also still alive, also still condemned, and also going nowhere. Kaufman's case sits in a kind of legal limbo that is unique to California. She was sentenced to die, and the sentence has never been overturned, but the state has made it clear that it has no intention of carrying it out. She is not free. She is not forgiven. She is simply waiting in a system that has decided to stop at the edge of its own authority. She is not the only one. There is one more woman under a California death sentence, and her case involves the youngest victim on this entire list, Rosie Alfaro. On June 15, 1990, a 9-year-old child was home alone after school in Anaheim, California. An 18-year-old acquaintance of the family knocked on the door, expecting the house to be empty. The child recognized her and let her in. What happened inside that home would produce one of the most painful capital cases in Orange County history. Maria del Rocio Alfaro, known as Rosie, was born on October 12, 1971, in Anaheim. By the age of 18, she was addicted to heroin and cocaine and had been in and out of trouble. She knew the family whose home she entered that afternoon. She had visited before as a guest of an older daughter. She came that day to steal, expecting nobody to be home. When the child answered the door, what had been planned as a burglary became something far worse. The child was harmed fatally. What the investigation uncovered, and what the autopsy later confirmed, was staggering in scope. The findings were described in court filings as deliberate and sustained. Alfaro fled the home with a television, a typewriter, a VCR, and other items valued at roughly $300. She sold them to buy drugs. The child's mother returned home that evening and found her daughter. Police responded immediately. The investigation moved quickly. Alfaro had left a bag of her own clothing, including blood-stained shoes that matched prints found at the scene, at the home of an acquaintance named Maria Ruelas. Alfaro had told Ruelas she was fleeing to Mexico. Investigators recovered the bag on June 24th. An arrest warrant followed. On June 25th, during a 4.5-hour videotaped interview, Alfaro confessed after waiving her rights. She later tried to blame an unnamed male accomplice, but the evidence pointed squarely at her. She was tried in Orange County Superior Court and convicted in March of 1992 of first-degree murder with robbery murder and burglary murder special circumstances, plus personal use of a deadly weapon. The first penalty phase jury deadlocked 10-2 in favor of death. A second jury returned a unanimous death verdict on July 15, 1992. At 20 years old, Alfaro became the first woman sentenced to death in Orange County history. The California Supreme Court affirmed her conviction and death sentence on August 6, 2007. A brief reprieve came in 2014 when a federal judge declared California's death penalty system unconstitutional, temporarily vacating her sentence. The Ninth Circuit reversed that ruling in 2017, and her death sentence was reinstated. Alfaro remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Like Cynthia Kaufman, she is protected from execution by Governor Newsom's moratorium. Her death sentence stands, but the state cannot carry it out. In a jailhouse interview years after her conviction, Alfaro described the moment the child recognized her at the door and smiled, a smile that turned to fear. The detail, carried in the Orange County Register, remains one of the most difficult passages in the public record of any California capital case. The child's mother has attended every court proceeding in the case for more than 3 decades. She told the Register that you would think after all this time you would get over it, but you do not. She said the hurt is still there, that it is always there no matter how much time passes. She said she goes to every hearing to be with her daughter because her daughter cannot do it for herself. As of 2026, Rosie Alfaro is 54 years old. She is alive. She is condemned, and the family she destroyed is still waiting for something that the state of California may never deliver. These 10 women walked 10 very different roads to the same destination. Some were executed, some are still waiting. But in every case, the damage they left behind has never fully healed, and for the families of their victims, it never will. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.